Well, hello and welcome to our talk in which we are going to share a snippet of conversation from the 2 years or so that we spent travelling through gender, time and space together. My name is Indy and I worked with Manджа for a couple of years, talking about this stuff. And
I'm Manджa, Indy's co-researcher, and I'll be sharing some of my learnings from a narrative therapy perspective a bit later on.
And we would like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting and recording on the lands of the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the wider Adelaide region, and we recognise their continuing connection to country and to culture, and we pay our respects to elders past and present, and to the future and emerging leaders. We acknowledge that the sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people was never ceded, and that the effects of colonisation continue into the present. And as non-Indigenous Australians, we also acknowledge that we continue to benefit from the dispossession of First Nations people. We'd also like to pay tribute to and honour the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sister girls and brother boys and all First Nations LGBTIQ people. So I am a white, queer, non-binary trans person living on unceded garden land in South Australia, and I hope that some of the things I have to say today might be useful for other folks who are also travelling through gender, time and space, or who are supporting other people while they make that journey. I'm using a lot of different language today to talk about myself, and it tends to be pretty loose as I tend to hold gender and sexuality and identity quite loosely. So when I started thinking about what would be useful to share today, I thought first of the threshold work and practices that were in place that made my therapeutic relationship with Manджа possible. Things like using the correct language and pronouns. It would be easy to spend time talking about those things in terms of a how-to for working with gender diverse clients because they're really important. However, there are lots of other sources of that information, some of which I think are in this broader training series. And there was other more radical stuff that Manджа and I did together beyond Gender Diversity 101, so I thought that might be more interesting to share. So I didn't know anything about narrative therapy or narrative practices before I went to see Manджа. I didn't know that she was a narrative therapist. What led me to her as a counsellor was instead a search for someone who had queer knowledges and possibly queer experiences as well. I'd ended my work with a different counsellor previously when our differences in understanding of gender left a chasm that was too wide for us to meet. And initially when I sought out seeking Manджа, I was thinking a lot about language and kind of lingo, and specifically wanting someone who was comfortable with using they pronouns, which are the pronouns that I use, and not misgendering me, and that was kind of my bottom line. Since then, and across my work with Manджa and beyond, I've since realised that I'm looking for something more, and more than just someone who isn't afraid of using they pronouns. And I came to learn that narrative ideas had more to offer me therapeutically than just talking with someone who had some knowledge of being queer. And since working with Manджa and then I believe that narrative practice and narrative ideas hold a great potential for working alongside the knowledges of queer and trans people. And that's what I want to talk about today. But I can't stress enough how important it was that Manджa kind of had some of that bottom line, which is to say language and terms are important. And these can be easily learned, but they will only go so far in the possibilities of transformative work, in my experience. So I've got 3 things that I'm going to share about our work today that stick out to me the most as being the most transformative. The first is the work that we did to reposition me as an expert non-binary being and to depathologise my existence. Then the second is about how this process enabled me to explore and heal from some of the challenges in my gender journey. And lastly, I'm going to share about how our work enabled me to reclaim my history as girl or woman. So when Manджa and I started our work together, I was nearly a year out from having had chest surgery, and as a part of that process, I was engaged with lots of medical practitioners who were assessing me and making decisions about my body and my gender and giving me diagnoses here and there, and I was kind of having to play a game for them and perform for certain processes so I could access the care that I needed. This is a really common experience for many trans folks that access healthcare within Australia's mainstream medical system, and more broadly globally, I would assume as well. So through this process of conversation with the medical sphere, apart from it being quite disempowering, I started to have to see myself in ways that didn't align with who I knew myself to be. For example, I had to buy into the idea of hating my body, which is a prerequisite for wanting to change it, of course. And these new enforced narratives about my gender were summoned in order for me to fit particular diagnostic criteria. So one of the things that Manджа helped me to do was to flip the dynamic and to name and examine the forces that were pushing those ideas on me, and to help me see myself as not a victim of those systems, but actually as a navigator, an expert of moving through those systems. And we extended that reversal into other areas of my life, anywhere where binary gender systems were being pushed on me, at work, at uni, in my family, in my community. Manджа helped me name the ways that my refusal to be pushed towards male or female was an act of resistance, and to help me see how my years of doing that had resulted in me in possessing a whole range of special skills and sneaky ways of being. For example, I started to use gender-neutral titles such as professor and doctor when I couldn't access a genderless title. I'm not a doctor, FYI. And when it came to existing in those medical environments, I felt empowered to use the language required to access what I needed, while remaining strong in the sense of who I was. And I saw those concessions as more as pesky tasks or small white lies required to satisfy external processes, but as not having a real bearing on my queerness or my gender. So what made all of this possible? I think what made possible this work was our shared understanding of gender in a post-structural context. Everywhere else in my life for a really long time had wanted me to state clearly that I was either a man or a woman deep down, but I simply did not feel that way. And post-structural accounts of gender align with this view. So even though Manджа and I didn't specifically talk about post-structuralism in our sessions, it was handy to have those ideas in the room and available to us. It made possible to name this dominant position of binary gender, and it helped us to name how gender was coercively being imposed on me, and to see what might exist beyond those impositions. I had found someone who agreed with me about my gender, or rather agreed with me about gender in general. Manджа could accept what was essentially quite a simple proposition, I don't feel like a man or a woman, without the drama and confusion this seemed to cause in almost all other contexts of my life. I believe post-structuralism was largely responsible for this quiet knowing between the two of us, and it made much more possible for our work together. Specifically, I was able to move on and talk about the struggles that were relevant to me in my travels through gender, time and space. So I think, and these are varied, and I think living in communities steeped deeply in the gender binary, as most of us do, and steeped in biological essentialism, means that most trans people and queer people struggle with some aspects of their queerness and transness, and then develop skills to resist the rest of the world's problems with their queerness and transness. And of course, these struggles and skills are uniquely different for each person and are always in relationship and influenced by other parts of who we are: class, race, ability, age, sexuality. So the things that have been hardest for me as I've learned about my gender as a white middle-class young person in so-called Australia might ring true for other trans folks, but I haven't found my particular challenges much represented in mainstream trans discourses. Typically this discourse contains other accounts, and they're wide-ranging, about violence and discrimination, trauma associated with our bodies, trauma associated with living as the wrong gender, a desire to change our bodies, a fear of being misgendered. And often when I had reached out to talk about my own experiences and what was on my mind, I was expected to talk about those particular things. And while some of them have been a part of my story, they weren't actually what I wanted to talk about with Manджа. So I'm going to share one of those things about my experience of grappling with being a non-binary trans masculine person living in the world. And yeah, to frame that as the post-structuralism being the key that kind of moved us into that space. So finding my way into my gender has involved a lot of pain and loss and a lot of joy and discovery. My mum is a really strong woman, and growing up I was luckily surrounded by many strong feminist and queer women. And the struggles and triumphs of womanhood and queerness are a really important part of my story. When I was moving through the world as a woman, I had a lot of pride and a sense of purpose. And when I started to move around in queer and feminist spaces as a young person, that story deepened. So it was scary for me when I started to question whether those identities and spaces fit for me in the way that they had. When I ventured into the blurry expanse between being a masculine woman and being a non-binary trans-masculine person, it became really scary. I had really held back from playing and exploring boyhood and masculinity because I had come to associate masculinity as intrinsically negative, inherently violent way of being. So I had great fears about what embracing masculinity would mean for me and my queerness, and particularly my feminism. And I thought a lot about betrayal and the betrayal of queer women who had come before me and fought to exist as masculine women. And I had many real archetypes of this in my life who were uncomfortable with me moving into a more masculine way of being. And I was afraid of losing those relationships and losing my relationship with that cultural heritage. So I was ashamed of my masculinity, and I felt a bit guilty that it existed. But at the same time, I was still a bit suspicious of the idea that I had to be a man. So I was sort of caught between two opposing forces. I didn't feel male, but I started to wonder whether my guilt around masculinity was stopping me from seeing this internal truth that maybe I really was male. So it was complicated, and there was a lot of forces of biological essentialism that were making their way into my thinking. And trying to wade in these waters wasn't made any easier when the pressure to conform to being a real trans person and to commit to one gender or another was a constant battering wave. I was grateful for the space available with Manjha to pull these things apart. One of the radical things about working with Manjha was that she also happened to be an older than me queer woman, and in many ways a representation of the archetype who I felt that I was failing the most. And her response to my challenges was to help me to take apart my fundamental beliefs about masculinity and femininity. And in doing that, to begin the long and never-ending process of allowing myself to consider masculinity as something that could contain more than just violence and control, and perhaps something that I could embody sometimes if I wanted to. And for that still not to mean that I had to be a man. So I was not only given permission to engage with my own masculinity from a place of curiosity and acceptance and joy while still standing as a non-binary person, but I was given permission to do this by a queer woman. So that was a pretty unique and blessed experience for me. And I don't think that all trans people need to work with other queer people for it to be beneficial, because there was a lot of stuff probably in Manjha's experiences as a queer person that brought to our relationship. But I think what ended up being most useful to me were the narrative ideas about gender and masculinity, because without explicitly having an account for non-binary gender within her practice yet, Manjha didn't need to know that or have that when I said, I don't feel like I'm a man or a woman and I don't believe in those things. And the unpacking that we did also let me circle back to those queer and feminist spaces that had originally been a source of community for me. And my relationship with feminism, queerness and women has really changed, and it has involved grief and loss. But now I feel comfortable in claiming that cultural heritage and engaging with feminism in a way that is more true, I think, for me, and I hope as well that I'm a better, more nuanced and more intersexual feminist for that experience. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the thickening of my story of gender and reclaiming my history as a woman and a girl. So pretty early on in our work together, Manjha asked me about moments in my childhood and my younger life where I had felt really good in my gender, and I had never been asked to talk about those moments before. Most of the people that I spoke to, doctors, other counsellors, youth workers, friends and family, only wanted to hear about my gender pains and moments of enforced femininity that were traumatic. So there was a really big focus on reliving and talking about the traumatic moments of my gender. I had a lot of those stories ready to go. In fact, I'd spent such a long time telling those stories that I'd forgotten about a lot of the other times as a little kid when it hadn't actually been an issue. In some cases, I'd been required to tell those stories as part of diagnostic criteria. But as it turned out, I had a pretty good time being a little non-binary kid. In fact, aside from some exceptions, I basically spent most of my pre-adolescent years in a genderless tomboy wonderland, riding my bike, camping, doing drama classes, cooking cakes, and having skateboarding accidents. I didn't have any moments of wishing that I was a boy, because the fact that I was a girl wasn't really something that I was too conscious of that. And I'm very lucky and grateful for that experience, and to my parents for that experience. But I had forgotten most of that whole childhood because I had chosen or been required to tell a different story so that I would appear really trans. And when Manju got to me to talk about times where I'd felt really in my body as a kid, I reconnected with a big chunk of my history that I decided was redundant because I'd been a girl while it had been happening. And I really wanted to distance myself from those memories so that who I was now would be taken seriously. So what we did to respond to that was to explore the ways that I had been non-binary my whole life, rather than just being non-binary at the age, when I came out, or when I started using they pronouns, or when I had chest surgery. So we talked about how I'd been non-binary even as a little kid riding around on my bike, and many other examples. And I can see now that was really true, because it wasn't until I hit adolescence and I had a bunch of adults with feelings about who I should be tell me that I needed to be a girl that I started to see myself that way too, and that's when I started to come up against my gender challenges, I guess. So it was really healing for me to realize that I didn't have to be disconnected to those parts of my life, because that was my whole life, and otherwise I would have not existed for the first 20 years of my life, which would be a bit sad. So we came up with this metaphor of the lost tomboys, which I like to think about. It sort of illustrates the deepening of this gender story. And in this metaphor, I'm playing with a bunch of kids. We're floating down a river on rubber tires, and we're having a really great time. And then we come across this whirlpool of coercive ideas about gender. And we all get swept into the pool, and it's spinning around, and while we're in there, we have to conform to the way that the water is moving, and a lot of us are getting pulled in under the water, and I get pulled in, and I'm in there for quite a long time, sort of 7 or 8 years, and then somehow I manage to drag myself out of the water really slowly, and it takes a long time, but eventually I get there, and then I'm at the edge of the pool looking back, wondering what is going on in there, and whether everybody else knows what's going on in there and why nobody's saying anything about it. But actually, there's a lot of people around me on the side of the whirlpool asking those same questions. And there are also a lot of people still in the water. And a lot of them are my friends, and they are all the lost tomboys that are still making their way out. And I'm still in that river as well, and there's plenty of other whirlpools and waterfalls further down the stream. So what's important for me about the metaphor is that I've always been in the same river. I didn't have a beginning gender life and then there's no disconnect. It's all the same. It's all the same, and it's all a part of who I am. I've always been a lost tomboy, or maybe now I'm a found tomboy, and a non-binary person. But I did get swept up in the whirlpool for a while, and the other piece of that work is looking at how the whirlpool got to be there. But that is a story for another time.
So now it's my turn to be sharing some of my learnings as Indy's co-researcher. So I'm referring to myself in this talk as cisgendered, although I do find this label a little problematic. For example, it can reproduce the gender binary even while it's trying to undermine it. You can read about some of these dilemmas in the articles included in this online course. Despite these dilemmas, though, it is the best term I have for now for making visible an otherwise hidden set of privileges enjoyed by people who experience a taken-for-granted sense of alignment with the gender they were assigned at birth, like myself. So I asked myself 3 questions to frame this talk. What did I learn/unlearn? What narrative ideas and practices did I draw upon? And how have these conversations influenced my practice? Whenever I meet with people, I like to attend to the politics of therapy by making a quick mental power relations scan. So with Indy, I held privilege not only because of my cisgender, but also because of my age and my position as a mental health professional. We did, however, share the same English language, were both white, temporarily able-bodied, and presented as neurotypical. We also both held the privilege of a university education and belonged to the same broader queer community. My starting point as a narrative practitioner meeting with Indy for the first time was that they were the expert on their own life, and my position as co-researcher aimed at centering their insider knowledges around gender identities. I also started from the belief that the problem is the problem, not the person, and in the course of hearing about what was troubling Indy, externalised a range of what they called hard, isolating or immovable stuff in their experience of gender identity expression. I approached each conversation with the assumption that identity is dynamic, that language shapes us, and that Indy and I would each be shaped by and shaping of the other, albeit differently and within the broader context of intersectional power relations. I entered our conversations with the intention of taking on this learning-unlearning stance in relation to trans and non-binary genders. And Indy contributed to this project in tangible ways every time we met, both by pointing me towards useful articles and websites and in the conversations we shared, showing kindness and generosity even when I made the same blunders over and over again. I oriented myself around the narrative idea that problems are located in the social and relational realms and constructed in discourse. Discourse being those ways in which language and power combine to shape knowledge, giving value to some knowledges as right, good and proper, and devaluing other knowledges as false, unnatural or wrong. So when dominant discourse is at odds with a person's preferred identity expression, this can lead to experiences of living that are hard, isolating and immovable. Part of my learning-unlearning project meant grappling with the fact that the cis, age and professional privilege and power that I carry leaves me susceptible to the many biases and prejudices embedded in dominant discourse about trans and non-binary genders. For example, when I explored the literature on gender generated within the profession of mental health, I discovered plenty of material that was universalising and pathologising of trans and non-binary gender expressions under the broad umbrellas of the diagnostic labels of gender identity disorder and more recently that of gender dysphoria. I then did a search for studies evaluating the impact of cisgendered therapist biases in therapy, but I couldn't find a single one. And learning about this gross imbalance in the dominant discourse only strengthened my resolve to privilege the insider knowledges that Indy and other trans and non-binary folks could offer. I sometimes think about discourse as being a bit like couch grass. This is an aggressively growing grass, common in Australian backyards, and anyone who's ever tried to dig up a patch of couch grass will know just how incredibly hard it is to get rid of. And for me, just like couch grass, dominant discourse reproduces itself via this vast underground network of extremely tenacious, normative judgments, beliefs, assumptions and values. Years ago, when I worked as a counsellor advocate with victim survivors of sexual violence, I found a handy image for exposing dominant discourse in the form of a so-called upside-down map of the world. I hung this map on the wall in my counselling room, and sometimes when dominant discourse was proving difficult to deconstruct in our conversations, I shared a story about the time I first saw this map and how my initial impulse had been to turn it around the right way because it looked wrong. And it was, of course, only wrong in relation to the dominant Northern Hemisphere view of Earth. So referring to that upside-down image helped me talk about gender discourse as being constructed in relation to just one particular view of gender, one informed by patriarchal truth claims and normative judgments, and that these particular ideas about gender also underpinned acts of gendered violence. One example of the influence of dominant discourse on my own contributions was reflected in the difficulties I had with misgendering, especially in the first year or so. Despite my determined intentions to unlearn binary pronouns, this expression of cis dominance happened many, many times. I sometimes did manage to catch myself before I spoke the wrong pronouns, but even when I got the pronouns right out loud, those binary norms continued to lurk about in the corners of my mind, always ready to jump in and reassert themselves in all kinds of sneaky ways. I only discovered these when reflecting on the conversations afterwards, noticing then some embarrassing examples of persistent normative assumptions about masculinities and binary understandings about gender. So these insights afterwards, hindsights, would leave me feeling a bit discouraged and something of a failure as a narrative therapist. But overcoming that misgendering was one way my conversations with Indy have changed my practice for the better. But even more embarrassing than that, for myself though, was my growing awareness of all the mistakes I didn't even realise I was making. My learning-unlearning project was exposing more of the ways in which cis dominance and mental health expert knowledges were interconnected. And then I began to notice that the shame generated by these reflections and the fear of making even more awful blunders were threatening to silence me to the point where I risked not only allowing these fears to become centred in our conversations, but where the embarrassed silence could render me non-influential, the opposite of my intention to be what Michael White has described as taking a decentered and influential positioning in therapeutic conversations. But luckily, I had previously learned enough about privilege and power in therapeutic settings to know that it's possible to refuse these feelings of shame and of failure. I knew that if I could persist long enough through the discomfort of this learning and unlearning, I would slowly move towards a new appreciation of just how deeply ingrained and slippery and clever the gender binary is in our everyday thinking and speaking, and to discover new ways of sidestepping these. But all the same, refusing shame and fear in these ways was something that I had to persist with again and again, many times over. But as I persisted, the job of learning and unlearning was also helped along by some truly exhilarating and reinvigorating glimpses of what a society in which multiple diverse genders were the norm might be able to offer. Not just trans and non-binary folks, but cisgendered persons as well. Further glimpses of the transformative potential that personal and collective acts of challenging cis privilege offered to wider feminist projects, such as those aimed at ending gender-based violence, also proved very effective in reducing the influence of shame and fear in my co-research contributions. So Indy's stories and the insider knowledges shared by other trans and non-binary writers, artists and activists have taught me that dominant discourse on gender can have very real consequences for anyone daring to step outside its boundaries. I learned how anyone found transgressing these normative gender categories can be subjected to various disciplinary actions, ranging from the humiliations of name-calling and labelling as unnatural and perverse, to the denial of human rights, to being the target of intense humiliations and hatred, to threats of physical violence, actual physical violence, and murder. And while race, class, and ability privilege might have protected Indy from these extremes of violence, the combined effects of a multitude of daily microaggressions routinely acted against them, often in ignorance and by people who cared about them, is what had backed Indy into that hard, isolating and immovable corner of life. Our co-research into Indy's childhood history, approached from this deconstructive and critical thinking standpoint, enabled not only the digging up of several wheelbarrow loads of dominant discourse, but also provided opportunities for discovering a range of resistances and both personal acts of agency and collective initiatives Indy had engaged in. Taking the narrative approach that people's lives are multi-storied allows for the possibility to disrupt the universalising and totalising tendencies of dominant discourse through an exploration of resistances, refusals, acts of rebellion, and through the thickening of previously unstoried accounts of preferred gender identity. In the course of our conversations, Indy had offered up a treasure trove of sparkling moments about clothing choices, eyebrow preferences, haircuts, jewellery, and more, all of which suggested options for possible alternative storylines about the ways in which Indy had kept sight of their own hopes, intentions, dreams, commitments, and beliefs about their life, and how they did this in the face of overwhelming cisgendered dominance. At one point during our conversation, Indy was recalling a half-forgotten fragment of memory about going swimming one day, wearing nothing but their board shorts. It had been a carefree summer's day when they were about 10 years old, with nothing to do but play with good friends and relish the vigour and endless energy of young bodies. For Indy, in that moment of time, there was nothing more natural and joyful than just peeling off their summer top and leaping bare-chested into the pool. As Indy recalled the story, they told me that they remembered seeing this fleeting glimpse of shock in the eyes of their two male companions as they peeled off their top and dived for the pool. And in re-engaging with and deconstructing this small moment of history, we were able to see something that had been quite hidden at the time, that deeply tangled underbelly of the dominant gender order. And to see in that moment of transgressing gendered swimwear norms, how Indy had acted to spontaneously and powerfully tear at those roots. This kernel of memory was named by Indy as a broader lifelong commitment to messing with the gender binary. And this became the linchpin around which a whole new set of stories about Indy's preferred gender identity could be richly described, and which enabled both a recognition of and a re-engagement with their non-binary, gender non-conforming childhood. So, although the act of leaping topless into the pool on that hot summer's day was a spontaneous exercise of personal agency, that decision didn't come out of nowhere. And we were able to trace some of the steps leading up to that moment in the choices Indy had made from as early as they could remember about their own preferred ways of doing gender, leading to the discovery of a pretty cool non-binary kid. By asking Indy to actively search for more of these fragments of memory and thinking about who else might have witnessed these moments of Indy's resistance to gender norms, we were able to further thicken these stories through time and across both the landscapes of action and identity. These narrative practices of deconstructing dominant discourse and of mapping insider knowledges of richly describing sparkling moments and co-authoring alternative stories of resistance, were further bolstered by Indy's involvement with collective action and social movements. And as cis therapists attending to the politics of therapy, we can support these collective initiatives as allies. For example, by getting our workplaces to honour the International Trans Day of Remembrance, remembering trans people killed around the world each year, and the International Transgender Day of Visibility, celebrating survival. We can also join local campaigns and actions, such as those developed by our Canadian colleague Tiffany during the 2010 Masters of Narrative Therapy and Community Work. So, to finish, as has often been the case throughout many years of working as a feminist narrative therapist and community worker, these conversations proved richly rewarding for me. The conversations I had with Indy has meant that the subsequent conversations I've had with non-binary, trans and gender fluid people since then have been far more effective. In addition, Indy's insights into the potential for diverse expressions of masculinity, including those that have emerged from a cool non-binary childhood in a genderless tomboy wonderland, have gifted me with the hope for a future where diverse gender expressions can proliferate, where the gender binary is no longer used as a vehicle for enacting dominance. And I've also discovered new stories about my own personal struggles with these gender norms. So I remain deeply grateful to Indy and to all trans and non-binary folks for your contributions to my life. Thank you.